Did you ever tell me the truth about our family? The words hit me like a sudden chill in the middle of a quiet afternoon, and I froze in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, unremarkable yet comforting in its routine. I, Eleanor Harper, at 72, had spent my life meticulously caring for my home, my son, Jacob, and watching over our little suburban street where maple trees painted the driveways golden in autumn. The text on my phone was from an unknown number, and yet, something about it tugged at a familiar unease I had learned to trust over the decades. I set the cup down with careful precision, my hand steady despite the sudden racing of my heart, and looked around the sunlit kitchen where everything was in place, the granite countertops gleaming faintly, the old oak table polished just yesterday, the silverware aligned as if awaiting company that would never arrive. I remembered the calm of this very room just last week, Jacob laughing with his wife, Melissa, over a trivial disagreement about the garden gnome in the front yard, their voices mingling pleasantly until I retreated to my knitting in the living room, unnoticed but not unwelcome. Now, the silence was different, it carried a weight, a tension I could almost feel vibrating off the hardwood floors. I opened the message again, the words refusing to leave my vision. Do you know the truth about your family? I could hear Jacob's laugh from the front porch in my mind, the ease of family life I had assumed would last, and yet here was a fracture I hadn't anticipated, a fissure hidden beneath years of ordinary routines. My mind traveled back, noting subtle inconsistencies, bills that seemed slightly off, documents that had disappeared into the shuffle of my careful filing, and the way Melissa's eyes occasionally flickered with a secret I had not been privy to. I took a slow breath, letting the sunlight wash over the edges of the room, observing the dust motes dancing lazily in the beam, finding grounding in small details. I moved to the living room window, looking down at the front yard, noting the angle of the sun on the driveway, the shadows of the maples stretching long, and I realized that the familiar paths of my life had quietly shifted while I wasn't paying attention, subtle nudges that suggested deception. I recalled conversations I had brushed aside as ordinary, questions I had answered lightly, now heavy with unspoken meaning. Sitting down, I pulled out my small notebook, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and began to write what I had noticed in the past few months, each entry a potential clue in this suddenly mysterious landscape. I documented the unexpected phone calls Jacob received, the sudden need for Melissa to handle certain bills, the quiet moments when she would pause mid-sentence, her eyes not meeting mine, as if weighing words before allowing them to escape. My breathing steadied as I wrote, each notation a step towards clarity, a measured response to the jolt of the unknown. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into my fingers, grounding me, reminding me of the control I still held over my actions even if others had tried to obscure the truth. I made a conscious decision, I would observe first, act second. Each small detail I noticed would be catalogued in my mind and on paper, an arsenal of knowledge to understand the depths of the secret hinted at by that cryptic message. The quiet of the house was my ally, the sunlight a witness to my vigilance, and I understood that the seemingly peaceful rhythm of our suburban life was now a canvas for revelation, each brushstroke hidden in ordinary acts, waiting for me to connect them into a pattern that would unveil what had been carefully concealed. And as the afternoon drifted lazily towards evening, I felt the stirrings of resolve, a quiet power that had been cultivated over decades of careful observation, patience, and a steady hand. I would uncover the truth, not with anger, not with haste, but with the precision and calm that only years of living and watching had taught me, letting each hidden fact reveal itself in its own time, until the family secrets were no longer hidden, and I understood the full picture of the life I thought I knew. The next morning, the sunlight slanted through the kitchen blinds, casting stripes of gold across the worn linoleum floor as I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma filling the empty house. I moved slowly, savoring the quiet, the absence of conversation, a stark contrast to the usual morning chatter of Jacob and Melissa, who had long since left for work. I sat at the old oak table, pen in hand, reviewing the notes I had made the previous afternoon, each observation a small thread in a tapestry I was beginning to see more clearly. The mail had arrived, a small stack of envelopes, none of them unexpected, yet I handled each one with care, scanning for anomalies, the weight of curiosity pressing gently on my chest. I noticed a utility bill slightly higher than usual, a discrepancy that would have seemed trivial to anyone else, yet to me it suggested the possibility of withheld information or mismanaged funds. I set it aside, making a mental note, and reached for a photo album on the shelf, tracing my fingers over the faded covers, remembering birthdays, graduations, family trips. The images captured smiles and laughter, yet in the back of my mind, I began to consider the gaps, the moments that now seemed incongruous with the image of a harmonious family life I had maintained for so many years. I sipped the coffee slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirping of birds outside, and I allowed myself to remember subtle interactions with Melissa, how she sometimes avoided my gaze, the way she would answer questions with rehearsed politeness, small inflections in her voice that had seemed insignificant at the time. I recalled one evening, sitting together after dinner, when a casual remark she made about the house seemed oddly pointed, as if testing the boundaries of my knowledge. I wrote it down, noting the date, the context, the exact words. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb leading me towards a larger picture. I walked to the window and watched the neighbors walking their dogs, the rhythm of their lives ordinary and calm, yet I felt a separation, a distance created by the subtle manipulations of those closest to me. I took another sip of coffee and made a plan to observe more intentionally, to listen more closely, to watch without alerting anyone to my scrutiny. It was not a matter of confrontation yet, but a careful gathering of facts, a steady accumulation of insight. I moved about the kitchen methodically, checking cupboards, reviewing ledgers, noticing the placement of items that had been altered slightly, the small inconsistencies that might hint at oversight or intentional concealment. With each observation, my sense of the family shifted, the image I had long held of unity and openness fracturing into something more complex, more opaque. I set the pen down and folded my hands over the table, eyes narrowing slightly as I considered the path ahead. Patience would be key. I would watch, I would wait, and I would understand. The house was quiet, but my mind was active, connecting dots, imagining possibilities, constructing a narrative from subtle clues. I felt a controlled anticipation, a readiness to act when the time was right, confident that careful observation and measured response would reveal the full story, and that I, Eleanor Harper, would uncover the truth of my family in a way that was deliberate, calm, and precise. The afternoon sun had shifted, spilling warm light across the living room carpet where I sat with the photo album spread before me, each image a captured moment of smiles and celebrations, yet now carrying an unfamiliar weight. I traced my finger over a photograph of Jacob at his high school graduation, the excitement in his eyes frozen in time, and then over another of Melissa at our family Christmas dinner, laughing while passing the cranberry sauce. Something in the way she held herself, the subtle tilt of her head in that picture, spoke to a controlled performance I had only begun to perceive. I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes wander around the room, noting small details, the careful placement of a vase that had been slightly moved, a stack of mail I did not remember arranging, and it all built a quiet tension, a sense that not everything was as it appeared. I made my way to the desk where our family ledger lay, flipping through pages meticulously kept over decades, checking entries, noting discrepancies in amounts and dates, small enough for anyone to overlook, yet to me signaling that there were patterns emerging that had been intentionally hidden. I listened to the distant hum of traffic outside and the occasional bird call from the maple trees in the front yard, grounding myself in ordinary sounds while my mind worked through the layers of subtle inconsistencies. I recalled last weekend, when Jacob had stepped outside to make a phone call and Melissa had lingered behind, brushing past the living room without making eye contact, a casual gesture that now struck me as deliberate, a rehearsal in secrecy. I poured another cup of coffee and returned to the ledger, cross-referencing entries with bills and receipts, a meticulous task that required patience and focus, but each small discovery added to the mosaic I was assembling. I made careful notes, documenting dates, amounts, and minor anomalies, all with the calm deliberation of someone who had spent a lifetime observing patterns and drawing conclusions quietly, without alerting anyone. Each notation felt like a piece of a puzzle revealing itself, a subtle truth emerging from ordinary moments. I walked to the window again, observing the way shadows shifted across the driveway, the ordinary life of the neighborhood continuing obliviously, contrasting sharply with the careful scrutiny now guiding my actions. I reflected on my own role in nurturing this family, the years spent guiding, supporting, and creating a stable environment, and how quietly, without any dramatic confrontation, I had begun to reclaim awareness of the dynamics around me. With each observation, I felt a controlled anticipation building, a readiness to act when the right moment arrived, knowing that understanding would precede any confrontation, that clarity would be my strength. I allowed myself a small smile, not of triumph, but of resolve, recognizing that even in the quiet of this ordinary afternoon, I had begun to turn the hidden threads of family behavior into a narrative I could interpret, a story unfolding under my careful attention, each detail bringing me closer to understanding the full truth of what had been obscured until now. The evening light dimmed softly through the curtains, casting long, warm shadows across the living room floor, and I, Eleanor Harper, found myself standing by the window, observing the quiet street below, the faint sounds of children playing in the distance, the occasional hum of a passing car. The house seemed to breathe in these hours, holding on to the residual warmth of the day while harboring the subtle tension I had begun to feel more keenly with each passing moment. I carried a notebook in my hand, filled with notes, observations, and questions that had been accumulating over the past few days, each entry representing a clue, a discrepancy, a small piece of the puzzle that was quietly revealing itself. I flipped through photographs of family gatherings, noticing the slight misalignments in gestures, the fleeting expressions that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, yet now spoke volumes to me. I paused at a photograph of Melissa laughing with Jacob at a summer barbecue, the sunlight catching her hair just so, and I could not ignore the faint trace of calculation in the way she held the plates, the way she interacted with other family members. My gaze drifted to the kitchen, where the kettle whistled softly, a mundane sound anchoring me while my mind worked through the layers of potential deception. I made myself a cup of tea, the aroma grounding me, and returned to the living room chair, notebook on my lap, pen poised to record new insights. I considered conversations that had seemed innocuous, remarks that at the time I had brushed off as ordinary, now revealing themselves as subtle tests, moments of probing or gentle manipulation. I observed how Jacob had been distracted, occasionally checking his phone, diverting attention while small, seemingly insignificant details changed around the house, documents shifted, mail sorted differently, small financial irregularities. I documented everything meticulously, each notation a deliberate act of gathering understanding without alerting anyone to my growing awareness. I thought back to my own upbringing, the way I had learned to watch, to listen, to discern intent through gestures and tone, skills honed over decades, now applied in this quiet observation of my own family. As the shadows lengthened, I allowed myself to reflect on my feelings of calm control, the quiet empowerment that came from observation, the subtle knowledge that the small details would lead me to clarity. I made a mental map of what I had seen, arranging behaviors and anomalies into patterns that hinted at deeper truths, each piece contributing to a growing awareness of the dynamics at play within my family. I felt the deliberate pacing of time as an ally, knowing that my careful accumulation of facts and insights would ultimately allow me to confront what had been hidden, to understand fully the scope of actions taken behind the veneer of normalcy. The room held the stillness of anticipation, a gentle tension that balanced ordinary domestic tranquility with the inner workings of my mind as I prepared to navigate the complexities of trust, deception, and revelation that had quietly unfolded before me. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth seep through my hands, centering me as I plotted the careful steps I would take, the observations yet to make, and the subtle understanding that each small detail, however minor, was part of a larger story slowly revealing itself in its own time. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds, painting the kitchen floor with warm stripes that shifted as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I, Eleanor Harper, moved methodically around the space, arranging cups and saucers, as if the act itself anchored me in a familiar rhythm amidst the uncertainty I had begun to uncover. Each gesture was precise, deliberate, a reflection of the careful thought that had been accumulating in my mind over the past several days. I opened the notebook once more, reviewing the observations I had made, the small anomalies in behavior, the discrepancies in timing, the subtle signs of intent that had gradually revealed themselves like pieces of a hidden pattern. I remembered the soft laughter at breakfast a few days ago, the way Jacob had glanced at Melissa with an expression I had initially interpreted as affectionate but now seemed more measured, controlled, a silent communication I was just beginning to understand. I set the notebook aside and walked to the living room window, noting the motion of the trees in the slight breeze, the distant sound of a lawnmower, the ordinary cadence of a neighborhood unaware of the tensions quietly unfolding within my own home. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the warmth spread through my hands, grounding me as I considered the next steps, the careful observations yet to be made. My thoughts returned to Melissa, the small gestures I had catalogued, the way she handled documents and directed conversations in ways that suggested careful planning. Each detail, innocuous on its own, now formed a mosaic of intent that I was beginning to see with clarity. I made a mental note to observe the interactions at the dinner table later in the evening, to watch not only words but the silent language of posture, eye movement, and timing. The air in the house was still, punctuated only by the soft hum of appliances and the occasional creak of the floorboards, a perfect stage for attentive observation. I took a slow breath and allowed myself a sense of calm focus, the clarity of mind that came from years of patience and careful attention. Every small discovery, every subtle irregularity, contributed to a growing understanding, a narrative forming in my mind that was invisible to those around me. I sipped the coffee and considered the patterns emerging, each interaction, each tiny discrepancy, a signpost leading toward a larger truth. I moved quietly to the dining room, aligning the silverware, adjusting the centerpiece, performing tasks that appeared ordinary but were executed with an awareness that sharpened my perception. The light shifted again, highlighting the familiar textures of the room, the polished wood, the photographs lining the walls, each image now carrying additional layers of meaning as I read them through the lens of attentive observation. I allowed the sense of anticipation to build, a quiet readiness to understand fully before acting, knowing that the careful accumulation of facts, the patient watching, would ultimately give me the clarity necessary to address the concealed intentions within my family. With each note taken, each gesture observed, I reinforce my commitment to uncover the truth, to see the complete picture, and to respond with measured calm and precise understanding, allowing the unfolding events to reveal themselves fully while I remained the steady observer, prepared to act when the time was right. The late afternoon sun slanted through the living room window, casting a warm glow over the furniture, and I sat quietly in the armchair, notebook open on my lap, pen poised to capture any detail that might clarify the subtle mysteries I had been observing. I, Eleanor Harper, reflected on the small interactions that had accumulated over the past days, the way Jacob and Melissa spoke in tones that seemed ordinary yet carried a rhythm I had learned to read, the slight hesitation before a response, the manner in which documents were shuffled with deliberate care. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the heat fill my hands as my eyes swept across the room, noting the arrangement of chairs, the tilt of picture frames, the faint marks on the table where papers had been moved, each a small clue to a hidden narrative unfolding around me. I recalled a conversation last evening, seemingly casual, yet the choice of words, the slight redirection, and the unspoken emphasis now appeared carefully calculated, a test of my awareness. I wrote down the details, the time, the phrasing, the exact expressions observed, each entry a step toward understanding the larger picture. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic provided a subtle rhythm to my thoughts, grounding me while I considered the motivations behind these subtle behaviors. I moved to the kitchen counter and checked a stack of mail, scanning the dates, amounts, and addressees, noting small inconsistencies and unfamiliar entries, marking each with a mental flag for further observation. I walked back to the living room, settled once more into the armchair, and reviewed photographs from recent family events, paying attention to posture, gaze, and the positioning of hands and objects, small details that spoke louder than words when interpreted carefully. Each observation reinforced my understanding that the family dynamics were shifting in ways I had not previously noticed, and that awareness would be my instrument in navigating this delicate situation. I reflected on my own role within the household, the years spent maintaining peace, creating routines, and ensuring comfort, realizing that these years had also taught me to observe, to notice subtle deviations, and to prepare for moments requiring discernment. I allowed my mind to wander through these patterns, imagining potential explanations and outcomes, considering each possibility without rushing to conclusions, maintaining calm and measured attention. I set the notebook aside briefly and looked around, noticing the sunlight now shifting, casting softer shadows across the room, the familiar textures of wood and fabric providing a sense of continuity amidst the emerging complexity. I returned to my notes, systematically recording thoughts, behaviors, and anomalies, creating a detailed map of observation that would serve as my guide. Patience and careful attention remained my tools, the quiet accumulation of facts and subtle insights allowing me to prepare for the moment when understanding would culminate in clarity, ensuring that any actions taken would be deliberate, precise, and grounded in a full comprehension of the unfolding family dynamics. With each passing hour, I felt a steadying confidence, the knowledge that meticulous observation and careful documentation would reveal the hidden truths, and that I, Eleanor Harper, was fully equipped to interpret, respond, and reclaim insight into the circumstances that had quietly developed in my household. The sky outside had softened to a pale orange, the light spilling gently into the living room where I, Eleanor Harper, sat with a sense of quiet determination, notebook open on my lap and pen ready to capture the subtleties of the unfolding family dynamics. The house felt calm, almost serene, yet every object, every small detail held potential insight, the placement of a coffee mug, a note slipped between pages of a magazine, the faint angle of a picture frame slightly askew. I traced my eyes across these ordinary items, interpreting them as signals, tiny gestures that hinted at intentions hidden beneath everyday routines. I recalled a recent conversation over lunch, seemingly ordinary, where Melissa had inquired casually about the timing of certain bills and documents, and Jacob had answered without noticing my subtle observation, yet their responses and mannerisms were now laden with significance I had not seen before. I wrote carefully in my notebook, each line precise, documenting the time, the phrasing, the expressions, all while maintaining an outward appearance of calm and normalcy. I reflected on the patterns that had emerged, the repetitions, the slight deviations from expected behavior that suggested a carefully maintained narrative designed to keep me unaware. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth as it spread through my hands, grounding me while my mind processed the threads I had been collecting. The quiet of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, the gentle rustle of the trees outside, all contrasted with the focused intensity of my internal observation, the careful mapping of behavior into a coherent understanding. I moved slowly to the window, noting the way the sunlight now touched the tops of the maple trees, the shadows shifting across the yard, and I considered how my careful attention and patient observation had given me clarity that would otherwise have been overlooked. Each new insight was a piece of a puzzle, revealing the intentions and patterns of those around me, and I felt a measured sense of anticipation, knowing that understanding would precede any direct action. I considered the past weeks, the accumulation of evidence, the subtle tests of patience, and the small yet significant discrepancies that had built a picture of reality I was now fully able to comprehend. I reviewed the notebook once more, scanning each observation, confirming the connections, and allowing the clarity of understanding to settle, a steadying force amidst the quiet hum of the house. I took another deliberate sip of tea, letting the quiet and the warm liquid center me as I prepared for the next steps, confident that with patient observation, careful documentation, and a measured approach, I would navigate the intricacies of my family, uncovering the truths hidden in plain sight, and that each small detail, when read correctly, provided insight into the larger story that had quietly been forming around me. The early evening settled over the neighborhood, softening the edges of the trees and rooftops as I sat in the quiet of the living room, Eleanor Harper, pen in hand, notebook open, ready to record the observations that had accumulated throughout the day. The house was filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds returning to their nests, ordinary sounds that contrasted with the careful scrutiny I maintained over the small but revealing details surrounding my family. I reviewed the patterns that had emerged, the behaviors, the minor discrepancies, the subtle tests of awareness, each one now forming a more complete picture of intentions and concealed truths. I traced the movements of Jacob and Melissa as I remembered them from earlier interactions, recalling the tone of their voices, the cadence of their steps, the way they positioned themselves during conversations, all providing hints that had been invisible without deliberate attention. I noted the positioning of objects in the living room and kitchen, the alignment of photographs, the slight variations in document placement, each seemingly trivial but when read carefully revealing underlying shifts in routine and intention. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth settle my thoughts as I considered the timing of events, the coordination of activities, and the carefully chosen words that had been exchanged over the past week. My mind connected these observations into a framework of understanding, each anomaly becoming part of a narrative that was now unfolding with clarity. I reflected on my own role, the years spent maintaining harmony, providing guidance, and creating an environment of stability, and recognized that this experience required the same patient observation and careful judgment that had guided me for decades. I reviewed the notes one last time, ensuring that every detail, every subtle hint, was accounted for, and I felt a steadying confidence in my growing comprehension of the dynamics at play. I considered the next steps, knowing that the deliberate accumulation of insight would allow me to navigate the situation with precision, understanding fully before acting. The sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the floor, and I allowed a quiet sense of anticipation to build, appreciating the methodical process that had brought me to this moment of clarity. Each small detail, each careful observation, contributed to a complete picture of what had been obscured, revealing the hidden patterns of behavior and intention that I had patiently documented. I felt a calm determination, a readiness to act with thoughtful precision when the moment required, knowing that understanding and patience were my greatest tools. The house remained serene, ordinary in appearance, yet under my attentive observation, the truth of what had been concealed was becoming increasingly clear, and I was fully prepared to respond with measured awareness. Eleanor Harper, observing, recording, and understanding every subtle movement and gesture until the story of my family was revealed in its entirety. The evening deepened, and the warm glow from the lamps cast gentle pools of light across the living room where I, Eleanor Harper, sat quietly observing the stillness of the house. The notebook on my lap was filled with the culmination of days of careful observation, notes meticulously recorded, each one a thread in the narrative I had been piecing together with patience and precision. I reflected on the patterns I had noticed, the subtle gestures, the small inconsistencies, and the careful orchestration of daily routines that had hinted at intentions previously hidden. I traced the edges of photographs on the walls, remembering the moments they captured, the laughter at holiday dinners, the playful teasing during summer afternoons in the yard, the smiles that now, in light of my understanding, seemed carefully framed rather than spontaneous. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the warmth steadying my hands, and allowed myself to catalogue mentally the movements and expressions I had observed earlier in the day. Each slight glance, each carefully measured word, each seemingly trivial adjustment of objects within the home now contributed to a clear understanding of the family dynamics at play. I thought back on the conversations I had once accepted as ordinary, now revealing layers of intent and subtle persuasion, patterns that would have escaped notice without careful attention. I reviewed the timeline of observations in my mind, connecting behaviors, remarks, and small actions to discern their significance, understanding how each fit into the larger picture that had gradually revealed itself. The quiet of the neighborhood, the distant hum of cars and the occasional bark of a dog, provided a contrasting backdrop to the intricate awareness I maintained within my home. I reflected on my role over the years, the careful guidance and attention I had given, recognizing how those skills of patience and observation now served me as I navigated the subtle complexities of the relationships surrounding me. The house remained ordinary, filled with familiar objects and sounds, yet under my scrutiny each detail spoke volumes, conveying truths that had been carefully concealed. I allowed a calm anticipation to build, knowing that my understanding, gained through methodical observation and careful note-taking, positioned me to act with precision and clarity. I focused on the path ahead, the deliberate steps I would take to ensure that my knowledge was complete, that the insights gained would inform every choice, and that each carefully interpreted signal would guide my interactions and responses. With every note, every memory, every detail, I felt the quiet empowerment that comes from clarity, the assurance that the patient accumulation of observations had revealed the full story. As the night settled, I, Eleanor Harper, remained poised, attentive, and fully aware, ready to address the truth of the hidden patterns within my family, understanding that the careful observation, reflection, and patience I had maintained would ensure measured, deliberate, and insightful action when the moment arrived, bringing all that had been concealed into clear view.